Okay, what a pleasure to introduce our fearless leader, Jaap Roode. He is the Stanley McKinley Dobbs Professor of Biology, and his group studies the ecology and evolution of hosts and their parasites, I think with a particular emphasis on virulence evolution. And they most often work on monarch butterflies and their protozoan parasites. Jaap did his master's in population biology at Wageningen University in the Netherlands and his PhD at the University of Edinburgh. He directs IDASTP, co-directs MP3, and is also on the board of directors for the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail. Today he's going to be talking about his recently published book, Factories by Nature, How Ants, Apes, and Other Animals Heal Themselves. Please join me in welcoming Jaap.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's the first time I've been introduced in this seminar series. It feels very special. So normally this would be the point where I talk about, where the program came from, infectious diseases across scale, with some malaria research, some community ecology. But I decided this time I'm gonna talk about different scales. As you will notice, there's gonna be some word jokes, but also just thinking about really crossing scales. Let's think about medicine from an animal point of view. And so I really kind of think about what we have learned from animals, what animals can teach us, and how animals deal with all their parasites. And so I'll start by talking about my own research on monarch butterflies that really spurred this idea. And you may know that monarch butterflies are very famous for their migration that they undertake every fall. So in the fall, as milkweeds, which they rely on as caterpillars, when they die back, you have tens of millions to hundreds of millions of monarchs flying southwards to central Mexico. And there, in the space of that covers just the area of a few football fields, American football fields, they come together and cluster in these clusters, and then they stay there for the whole winter. And in the spring, they start mating, they start migrating north again. As milkweeds are coming back, they can start breeding, and that is how they then repopulate the whole United States and the southern parts of Canada. So this is a shot I took back in 2006, and I think it's just amazing to go there and basically you see a lot of like stuff on the trees, that's all butterflies. When you look up close, it's really butterflies upon butterflies. It's really, really beautiful and exciting. This is why monarchs are popular. And so they're so popular, in fact, that people love dressing up like monarchs and organize festivals. So this is a picture I took also in 2006 at the St. Mark's Butterfly Festival. They organize it annually in Florida, just south of Tallahassee, as the monarchs come through on their way. And I used to joke that these are my graduate students. They just don't want to finish, but they're actually just volunteers and people. This is how enamored people are with monarch butterfly migration. And this is at St. Mark's. This is where the monarchs come through every fall. But I also like to tell people this is not why I study monarchs, even though it's amazing. I study monarchs because they become sick. And they become sick with a really very beautiful parasite. And I'm saying that as a parasitologist. I did my PhD on malaria, and I love parasites. And so this to me is amazing. Beautiful protozoan parasite. Not that different from malaria parasites or Toxoplasma cryptosporidium. It's an apicomplex and protozoan parasite. And what it does, it forms millions of spores on the abdomen of the monarch butterfly. And those of you know that monarchs are part of the Lepidoptera, which means scaly wings. So this is literally infectious diseases across scales. Okay, I expected more of a reaction. So this is what the parasite does. And this is not your typical monarch butterfly picture, right? When you see monarch butterflies in National Geographic or at some random advertisement, because all sorts of companies use monarchs as advertisement. Even when I went to rent a bike in the Netherlands one day, several years ago, the advertisement had a monarch butterfly, which makes no sense at all, because monarchs have nothing to do with biking or the Netherlands, they don't occur there. And somehow it's just become this flagship species of nature that you use because they're pretty. This is not pretty because this monarch is very sick. And so this monarch is so infected that it's got so many parasites on the abdomen that there's all these little holes in the abdomen, and the monarch starts oozing liquids, dies of dehydration, and actually gets stuck to the pupal case. So this monarch is never going to fly, it's never going to lay eggs. And of course, nature is nature. So you got a beautiful paper wasp that says, cool, that's an easy meal for my sister, so let me take that and take that to my nest. And so that's what's happening here. Now, the nice thing about this system and why I'm still working on it, I started working on it in 2005. It is really the system that brought me to the United States, is that it's very easy to study. And what is nice is you can see if a butterfly is infected with a very non-invasive method. So we can put a little sticker. We used to cut little pieces of sellotape, and now we use just the mailing stickers that you can buy at Staples or wherever. Put it on the abdomen and you pull it off, and then you remove some of the scales. So the big things are the scales, and then the little things are the parasites. So there's tons of parasites, and you can immediately see whether the monarch is infected. So you can do this non-invasive research, and that is how we can track infections. That's how we can verify infections in the lab. We can look at what happens to monarchs in the wild over time, during migration, and so on. And what is important about the whole system is that monarchs rely on milkweeds, and I already mentioned that because in the fall, milkweeds die back. That means caterpillars can no longer eat. The monarchs fly south to overwinter until monarchs are back in the spring. And so a lot of research that we do involves the growing of lots of milkweeds. This is actually our greenhouse here up on the 7th floor of the parking deck behind here. And so a lot of our work focuses on that. And what is nice about that is that these plants are really important for driving the interaction between the host and the parasite. And so when we have these caterpillars eating the milkweeds, they're getting nutrients, but they're also getting a lot of toxins. And milkweeds are very famous for being very toxic. So if we eat milkweeds, we die, and so do most other animals. Now, monarch butterflies don't, because they're resistant to the toxins. These toxins are called cardenolides. And so what they also do is they actually take the chemicals, put them in their own tissues, and then they advertise that toxicity with their bright colors so that birds learn not to touch them. And actually birds will try them, and then they get sick, they throw up, and then through association learn not to touch them again. But, you know, that's how monarchs have been studied originally. It's like, oh, these chemicals, predators, and, you know, if you have, you know, learn about the field of ecology and trying to understand how nature works, originally was all, you know, intraspecific competition, and interspecific competition became important, and everything was driven by predators. And now we're finally at the point where we realize actually everything is driven by parasites. And that's my firm belief, at least to some extent. So I was interested in finding out if these milkweeds and these chemicals also have an effect on the monarch butterflies when they're infected. And so we started with very simple experiments. This is what I started when I was a postdoc. And we looked at the Asclepias incrinata, which is a swamp milkweed, doesn't have very many of these chemicals at all. And then we also looked at Asclepias parasatica, tropical milkweed, that is very toxic. And so you can look at these plants, they look very different. They actually smell completely different. I should say they look very similar. They smell completely different. If anyone is interested, I can take you to the greenhouse and let you do the smell test, because it's actually really remarkable. You can blindfold me and I'll go in the greenhouse and I can pick out the medicinal plant, which is cool. And so when we rear monarchs on this plant, they don't become as infected and they also don't become as sick. So infection rates go down, parasite growth goes down, and virulence goes down. So these plants don't just protect monarchs against predators, they also help against infection. Now it's interesting, you may have heard of Asclepios, the Greek god of healing, no? But you may have seen the medical symbol, which is often painted wrong, right? Because oftentimes you see, and it drives me nuts. So actually I was happy. This is what is in the Woodruff Health Sciences Center, they have it right. But most medical institutions have it wrong. They have what's the name? You were nodding. They have the two snakes, which is actually from the Greek god Hades, which is a different god. So there should only be one snake. And so this is Asclepios. Why does he have the snake? Does anyone know?
A parasite, right?
Yeah, but that's not the story I found. So there's two different stories. So one story is it's the parasite, you know, that you pull out of your arms and you do the little twist, one twist a day so you don't pull it apart. The other is that Asclepios actually learned medicine from snakes. And so he talked to snakes and snakes gave him wisdom. And that's the hypothesis I favor, because as I will show you, humans have learned from animals a lot about medicine. But Asclepias is the milkweed. So we have known for a long time that milkweeds are medicinal, and somehow you know, when we looked at monarchs, they said, well, they just use it for predators, which I don't think is the case. Well, they do, but I think they first use it as medicine. So we have done multiple experiments because when we found that the monarchs can benefit from this medicinal milkweed, my question was, can they choose? You know, when they are sick, are they going to preferentially use the medicinal milkweed? I remember when I first speculated on this, on our first paper that described the effects of milkweeds, one of the reviewers said, that's ridiculous. There's no way a butterfly can do that. And the editor said, you have to remove it from the discussion, which we did, because we're used to selling our souls in science. We want to get that paper published, even when we disagree, right? How oftentimes does peer review improve our papers? Not as many times as it makes them worse, I would say, but then we said, okay, we're gonna prove this reviewer wrong, we're gonna test it. So the first set of experiments we did was with caterpillars. We gave caterpillars the choice between the medicinal and non-medicinal milkweed, found absolutely no effect. So caterpillars cannot make a choice. One thing I'm gonna point out, this is a picture I took a few years ago, and this shows the 5 different instars that the monarch caterpillars go through. So this is the 5th instar. Can you see the first instar in this picture? Anyone? This one?
Yeah.
Look at how small. From this to that is a multiplication of 3,000 in 12 days. Wow. I calculated that once. That means I would have to turn into 2 blue whales in 12 days. That's the largest animal that's ever roamed the planet, bigger than the biggest dinosaur. And I would have to turn into 2. You notice from the very hungry caterpillars eat a lot. What the book doesn't tell you is they poop a lot too. But anyway, but the caterpillars make no choices. And then we thought, well, that kind of makes sense because it's really the mothers that determine where the caterpillars are going to eat. It's the mothers that lay an egg, the caterpillar hatches from the egg and then starts eating first the eggshell and then the plant. So then the question was, well, can the mothers make a choice? So we did these experiments in the greenhouse with these big cages. We had a medicinal plant, non-medicinal plant, and then we added a single butterfly in the cage, and there was a female butterfly that was pregnant, and she either had parasites or didn't. We left her in there for 2 hours, then came back, counted the eggs, and what we found is that they have a huge preference to lay their eggs on the medicinal plants when they're infected, but not when they're uninfected. So the infection triggers a preference for these more medicinal plants. How they know it? I don't know, but I would think that the taste and the smell of these very medicinal plants that are very bitter probably plays a role. So what that means is interesting because I told you earlier, these parasites have these these spores on their abdomen. And so when a female is infected, she already has the parasites. She cannot cure herself. The caterpillars cannot take care of their infection, but it's the mothers that can lay their eggs on more medicinal milkweed so that when her caterpillars hatch from the egg and start eating the medicinal plants, they have a lower chance of infection. And when they do get infected, they become less sick. So it's like mommy knows best. And so this was really to us an example of transgenerational medication where the mom is really medicating her future offspring. So we proved that reviewer wrong. I met her at a conference and I persuaded her. I didn't know she was. She came to me, she said, I was that reviewer. It's like, okay, well, let me show you some data. So that was fun. All right, William Osler. Has anyone heard of William Osler before? No? So William Osler was one of the 4 co-founders of Johns Hopkins. And he was also the medical doctor who designed the residency program. Because before he came on the scene, all the education for medical doctors was based on lectures, books, demonstrations. And his argument was you can learn as much or more on the bedside than from the classroom, which was a good call. But he also said this was in an address to McGill University in 1894, where he said, the desire to take medicine is one feature which distinguishes man, the animal, from his fellow creatures. So he said, medicine is something distinctly human, right? And this fit right in the whole idea that humans are unique, that humans are better. And every time someone comes up with that idea, we prove them wrong eventually, right? Humans are not the only species with language. We're not the only species that makes tools. We're not the only species that walks on 2 legs. We're not the only species that has culture. We're not the only species that has empathy. We're definitely not the only species that has medicine, right? So this fit within in the spirit of the time, but now we know this is just not the case. So when we look at nature, and so a lot of us think about infectious diseases as affecting humans, especially in this building, right? And then, of course, we think of infectious diseases in our pets, but infectious diseases and parasites are everywhere. And this is one of my favorite pictures that I have in my book, because you look at this clownfish and you see two pairs of eyes. Isn't that cool? There's the eyes of the fish, and there's the eyes of the parasite. So this is an isopod parasite related to the wood lice that you find in rotting wood or in your moist basement. And what this guy does, he goes to the tongue of the fish, bites off the tongue, attaches itself, and then when the fish eats, he gets a free meal, he or she. That's brilliant. I mean, when you're a parasitologist, that's like, oh my God. And it looks cute, right? Cute little eyes. Actually, so there is so many. So some of these populations, almost every clownfish has these parasites. So if you like snorkeling next time, pay attention, because you may actually see this. Very, very common. So these parasites are very common. And so when we think about animals using medicine, like what I talked about with the monarch butterflies and all the other examples I'm going to talk about, it's a change in behavior, right? So we're looking at an animal, it's infected, it's doing something that makes it better, reduces disease symptoms, prevents infection. But when you do this kind of work, it's really important to think about what actually is happening and who is getting the benefit. So I already said parasites are very common, so it makes sense that hosts have evolved the ability to resist them in many ways. Of course, there's immune systems, there's thick skins, there's social distancing, which humans do, but honeybees do it too, for example. And then there's medication. But on the flip side, parasites are really good at manipulating their host. And so there's tons of examples. I like this particular example, partly because it's a beautiful picture, but these are two houseflies. This one here is the female, and all this stuff here is a fungus. So she's full of fungus, and the fungus is sprouting and growing. This female is actually dead. And what's going on is that this fungus actually makes the female produce a lot of sex pheromones and also produces additional sex pheromones. And by infecting, the fungus makes the wings stand in a I am ready for mating display. So the male, who doesn't know better and is excited, goes to the female, mates, and gets infected, right? So this is a clear case of a fungus manipulating the host. Have you watched The Last of Us? Based on cordyceps, Ophiocordyceps fungi, they're very good at manipulating their hosts as well. Of course, that is an extreme example in the sci-fi series, but it's based on real fungi that do this to a lot of insects, where they infect them, change their behavior to increase their own spread, right? So the point of that is when you look at nature, you look at your host, you see a different behavior. You want to make sure, is it parasite manipulation or is it actually the host doing medication? And so a lot of the research goes into that. And then the question is, how clear is the evidence? So what I tried to do in the book as well is talk about some really good examples of medications, other cases where we just don't know yet. And one of those cases is these birds that are called great bustards that live in these grasslands. In this case, these are in Spain. And they have this mating display where the females really inspect the cloaca of the male. And these females are really picky, really choosy, and they like to mate with males that are healthy. And so they actually check whether there are parasites in the cloaca of these male birds. Now it's been shown that these birds, the males, eat a lot of these blister beetles during the mating season, way more than the females and way more than when it's not mating season. And these blister beetles are just beautiful. They have this, look, that when you touch it, it gives humans blisters, hence the name. And this is full of a chemical called contaridin, which kills a lot of parasites, right? So the hypothesis is these male birds eat more of these beetles when they need it, when they need to kill parasites so they can get matings. Great idea, but the follow-up studies haven't been done. So we don't know it yet. Very dark picture, but there's these great examples of lemurs and other types and monkeys as well that like to play with these bites and play with these millipedes. And these millipedes, like those beetles, they produce a lot of toxic compounds. So when you disturb one of them, they start oozing these liquids, and that usually defends them. But what this lemur is doing here is biting it and then getting a lot of that stuff, and it starts rubbing it in its own fur. And then you see different lemurs or different monkeys coming together. They start rubbing it in their own fur. Sometimes they actually steal insect repellents from tourists and start rubbing that in each other's fur. And what that does, it actually stops or protects them against mosquitoes and botflies. But researchers have noticed that they do it a lot more during the wet season when there is a lot more pressure of these parasites. But it's still a little bit observational because it's hard to do real experiments with these guys. And when you see them doing all this rubbing and having a good time, it's like, you know, when we go to, you know, a party and people get drunk, it's like, are we doing that to medicate ourselves or just to have a good time, right? So there's that alternative hypothesis. It increases their bonding and their social interactions as well. And that's when we think about if animals use medicine, we have to be really careful, do really careful studies. And so the first studies that did this were based on chimpanzees, and this was in the 1980s. And the studies were done by Michael Huffman, who is here. And here he's studying a monkey in Japan. He's done a lot of work on showing culture, basically these monkeys near Kyoto on a mountain. You can go there today and see them, and they get fed and everything, but they like to play with stones. And it has absolutely no function that people can figure out other than they just do it. Like a lot of stuff humans do, we just do it without increasing our fitness, right? So, and that was really the birth of the idea that animals have culture. And that broke one of those other barriers between humans and animals, right? And so you may be aware of the Japanese monkeys that wash sweet potatoes in the water, where only a few populations in Japan do it and no one else does it. So those are those cultural things where one monkey does it, the others pick it up and start spreading it. So the important thing for Mike Huffman, he grew up in Denver. He was really into Curious George, and he wanted to work with chimpanzees. That's what he told his mom at 4 years old. And he did everything he could to make that happen. So he started working at the Denver Zoo, and then he went to Kyoto to take his training in primatology. And that actually turned out to be really important because the Japanese primatology was very different from the primatology that was done in the United States and Europe. And it's based on the cultural differences and the cultural heritage. So in Western, European and North American primatology, we're very driven by this dualism that is really at the core of our culture and very much emphasized by Christianity. The idea that humans are different from nature and that therefore we cannot assign personalities to animals, we cannot anthropomorphize. Whereas in Japan, they have no trouble with thinking that humans are part of nature. And with their Shinto and their Buddhism background, they always view themselves as part of nature, probably helped by the fact that they live on an island where there's tons of monkeys as well. But what that means is that when Mike Huffman started studying chimpanzees, they did this in Tanzania, and that this was a long project, and the Japanese primatologists have given all the chimpanzees specific names. So they know who they are, they know they have different personalities, and that also ensured that they could see things that other people wouldn't have seen. And so one of the things they saw is this behavior here. So Mike Huffman did work, and he did it together with a ranger of Tanzania National Parks who was also a traditional healer in the local community there. And they were tracking chimpanzees to understand the role of older females in chimpanzee societies. But then one day they were tracking a chimpanzee called Chausiku, and they noticed she was not doing well. She was slow, she was lethargic, she built a nest in the middle of the day to sleep. She had diarrhea, she had dark urine, she defecated laying on her side, it was clearly, and then she had an infant that she just couldn't look after, so other individuals in the group started looking after the infant. And then what they saw was that she went to this plant called Vernonia, and then she never ate this plant, but she went to the plant, took branches off, stripped the bark of the branches, took bits of the inner pith, started biting it, sucking out the pith, and then throwing out the the rough material. And then Mohammadi told Mike Hoffman that they call that plant bitter leaf because it tastes bitter. And he told them that's a plant that the traditional healers in Tanzania use when they are sick, when they have diarrhea or other diseases. And so then Mike Hoffman thought, wow, maybe this chimpanzee is using medication. And so they went back to the basement. No one believed him, but he was excited and he couldn't wait till the next day. So the next day they went back, found her again, and they saw that 24 hours after she took the plant, she recovered. She was energetic. She was reunited with her infant. They started running, and Hoffman and Mohammadi couldn't even catch up. That is how energetic she was. And Mohammadi told him, this is exactly the amount of time that we know in our traditional healing that when we use this plant 24 hours later, people are cured of their symptoms. So that started a whole series of experiments that Hoffman did. So he looked at the chemicals in the plants and found that they were anti-parasitic, work against parasitic worms. He found that chimpanzees use the plant during the wet season when there's a lot of worms. He found that when they eat them, you can find feces with worms inside them. And so with all that in mind, and then he started seeing more of the observations where he could witness another female who did this, saw symptoms, saw her eat it, saw her recover. And so with that, he really described this as the first case, scientifically proven case of animal medication. Now, at the same time, there were other studies, and actually Jane Goodall earlier on had noticed that sometimes when you look at the feces of chimpanzees, that it contains whole leaves that haven't been digested properly. And so what chimpanzees sometimes do is they swallow leaves, then it's a very elaborate process. They fold them up, put them in their mouth, and they swallow them whole. And then they defecate them completely intact, so not digested. And so the question was, why do they do that? And a lot of work that Huffman did was showing that all the leaves that the chimpanzees use are very rough. So they're like essentially like Velcro. They're really rough leaves. They normally don't eat them. They swallow them whole. And then they found when you look at those leaves, oftentimes you see parasitic worms stuck to them. And the other thing that the worms or the leaves do is they irritate the gut. And so the chimpanzees start pooping at a higher rate and getting rid of the worms. And also that behavior happened more during the wet season. So that really showed, so that's how the whole field of animal medication really started in scientific ways by these experiments in chimpanzees. And at the time people said, okay, when they were finally persuaded, it's like, okay, that's cool, but clearly no other animals can do this because chimpanzees, well, they're like us, they got big brains. Okay, we'll give them that, right? But they couldn't believe that other animals did it. But at the same time, I already showed you monarch butterflies can do it, so now we know a lot of animals can do it. But at the same time, there was also a lot of research that showed birds do interesting things. And this nicely illustrated, this is actually the cover of the translation in Dutch of the book, and they put the starling on the cover. The starlings were really well known in the 1980s when this all happened, that they often put green plants in their nests. And people were trying to understand why is this, and they found that when the birds use more plants in their nest, they find fewer lice and ticks and mites that suck the blood of their chicks. And it's like, okay, this could actually be a way of medication, like fumigating the nest and getting rid of parasites. So a lot of that was observational, but there have been some wonderful experiments. And so you may wonder why I have got such an ugly picture here. So this is a sidewalk in Mexico City at the university campus there. And the point here is that there are these cigarette butts. You wouldn't see that at Emory because we have a no smoking policy, except on the 7th floor of the parking deck. I constantly run into people there that secretly smoke there. So, but this actually turned out to be really important for sparrows and finches on the Mexico campus. And so I went to meet Montse Suarez Rodriguez, who is a researcher who started as an undergraduate student to look at nest building by these birds. And her whole idea at the time was that when you work in an urban environment, these birds are going to end up with all sorts of crap, all sorts of trash in their nests, and that may be really harmful for the chicks, right? They could get suffocated on plastic or get strings around their necks and so on. And then what she found was when she looked at a lot of these nests, you found a lot of white, fluffy material. And you can see that here. So here she's pointing at, there's a lot of white fluff. You know, that's me excited about finding some fluff there as well. And started wondering, what is that? What is it doing? And she couldn't figure it out until it rained, and then she could smell the smoke. And then she went to her advisor, and he said, that's not cigarettes. You know how advisors are? Not me, but the rest of, of the advisor, And then she said, no, look, and she made it wet. I said, oh my gosh, that sounds like that smells like cigarettes. And so what these birds do, and so here's a picture, here's a bird picking up the cigarette butt, and they take them to their nest and they incorporate them. And they don't just dump them in there, they pull out the fibers and put it in the lining of the nest. And they found across a lot of nests that they look at, when there is more cigarette butts in the nest, sometimes there are more than 40 cigarette butts in the nest, they have fewer blood-sucking parasites. And then they thought, well, that's cool, but it still could be coincidental, right? It could just be that birds that collect more butts have this benefit, but do the birds do it on purpose? So then they did experiments where she actually had to create nests. And so here she's showing, she has a nest, and she had to make an artificial lining that wasn't rejected by the birds. And then she added, so she had to make artificial lining that had no cigarette butts. And then she added either live ticks that can suck the blood of the chicks, or dead ticks that can no longer suck the blood of the ticks. And I look over time, do the birds with live ticks collect more cigarette butts? And they do. So they respond to the presence of these bloodsuckers by collecting more cigarette butts, which then reduces, it actually pushes away, it deters these parasites, that increases the health and the fledgling success of the birds, but there's also costs. And that is something we find in everything that we do when we look at animal medicine, because some of the blood had malformalities in these chicks. So there's nicotine, which is the active ingredient of tobacco, but there's also a lot of other chemicals that are created during the smoking process. And so they have some negative effects on the blood. So, no medicine is free, like the Vernonia, the bitter leaf in chimpanzees. If the chimpanzees eat too much, they die. When we use medicine, we don't want to use too much because there's all sorts of side effects. In the US, there's TV commercials for medicines, very strange to me. That doesn't happen in Europe because your doctor should know about that, not you, right? But you read the description from it, there's always side effects, right? And we see that in nature as well. But so this is a really, cool story, I think, because it went from these observations to do an experiment and then directly say, yes, the birds do this in response to parasitism. And the reason they use ticks is, if they had used mites, some mites just live there, some suck blood, but with ticks, we know their only meal is a blood meal. And so birds can do this. Now, birds still are vertebrates, but ants can do it too. And so this is David Attenborough at an ant's nest in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland. And these nests are massive. So when you go to this landscape, he's kind of sitting behind it, but this nest would take like, a third of this room when you look at the whole size. Very, very big. And what's interesting is that it doesn't just have dirt and sticks and stuff. It also has this stuff, and this is resin. So resin is the sticky stuff that trees and other plants produce. So if you have grown up with Christmas trees like me, and it's time to put up the Christmas tree or remove it, you often get, sticky stuff in your hands. That's resin. And plants produce that to heal wounds and to resist insects and microbes and everything. And you see these ants, these are the wood ants in Switzerland, they collect these pieces of resin and they put them in their nest. And people have known about this for a long time, but it wasn't until actually one of the researchers in Switzerland who studied starlings got together with a researcher who studied the ants, and together they said, oh, maybe this resin is like those green plants that the starlings bring to their nest. And so what they found is that these ants do this as a kind of prophylaxis. And they do this mostly during the season when they produce babies, when they're most vulnerable. And when they put this into their nest, it reduces the growth of fungi, bacteria, viruses. So it has this real antimicrobial effect. And so again, they incorporate this to keep their whole colony healthy. And bees do the same. So this is a really nice comparison that Whole Foods did several years ago together with the Cersei Society, just to give you an image of what a supermarket looks like, the produce section in a supermarket, when we have bees or no bees. So this is what it looks like if you go to Whole Foods now. This is what it would look like if all the honeybees disappeared. And that's just to show that many of the things that we eat, a lot of our diet depends on honeybees. In fact, it's been estimated that 1 out of 3 bites that we eat is thanks to bees. And that even includes dairy. And that's because the dairy cattle is fed alfalfa and clover, which are pollinated by bees as well. So life would be very boring and tasteless without bees. The problem is that bees aren't doing so hot. And you may have heard these stories. There was a lot of talk about colony collapse disorder. We don't really know what it is, but we do know that bees have a lot of threats to them. That's in pesticides, but also parasites. This is a beautiful picture. Again, it's beautiful. There's a mite, the Varroa destructor mite. Very nice name. And so these are mites. If you put that in perspective, that would be a mite that size, my hand, just sitting on me for weeks on end and eating my liver. That's what they do. And oftentimes these bees have, 3 or 4 mites. So you can imagine this is not a good thing. And what they also do, they transmit all sorts of viruses, including deformed wing virus, which makes the whole bee, you get crumpled wings, the bees cannot fly. And when you have enough of it, the whole bee colony collapses. And we see a lot of these threats. There's other things, there is bacteria, all sorts of diseases that honeybees are dealing with. And the problem right now is, so when we think about our beekeeping practices, they're very industrialized. And what we like to do is, we keep these bees in really unnatural conditions. We built these hexagonal or cubic boxes that have 4 sides, a bottom and a top. We put all these frames in there, and then there's tons of bees in there, but also we don't let the bees use their own medication. And the reason for that is bees love to, like the ants, like to bring in resin into their nests, and they actually mix it with the wax from their own organs, and then make a substance called propolis. Propolis has been used by humans as medicine for hundreds of years, yet no one thought that bees may use it for the same reason. Just ludicrous. But that's what they thought. And so what beekeepers do is they hate the sticky stuff, because what the bees do, they put it, the only place where they can put it, a wild bee lives in a hollow tree and there's all sorts of crevices and holes and rough surfaces, and they smooth that over with propolis to make this beautiful propolis envelope. But when there are these boxes with really smooth planks, the only place they can put the resin is in the corners. And so they cement the lid closed. So beekeepers don't like it. When you take a beekeeping 101 course, the first thing they tell is you remove that propolis. It will impede your work. And that's true, but it also takes their medicine away. This is a bee that's specialized on collecting resin. You can see here, beautiful drops of resin. So they go out to trees, and this stuff is so sticky that when she comes back to the colony, she needs other bees to remove it from her leg. She cannot remove it herself. And then they make it into this propolis. And it turns out that you can actually make some really simple changes to the beehive. So instead of using smooth planks, you can make grooves in the planks. The bees then fill them up, and research of the USDA has shown this in the last few years, that you can do this and so let the bees medicate themselves, while at the same time, you still get your honey production, you still get your pollination services. And so it's just a way to bring back their own medical knowledge so that we can have healthier bees and therefore healthier humans as well. Similar things are happening in livestock industry. This is Juan Villalba, who works at Utah State University. And he and Fred Provenza, who was his mentor and later on his colleague, they have done so many experiments with goats and sheep that show that despite the fact that these animals have been domesticated for a long time, they still have a lot of knowledge about nutrition, about medication. And so when you give these animals a choice, and they've done experiments where you give them infections with worms, they start eating the foods that actually reduce worm burdens. But the food that does that is so bad for them that as soon as the worms are gone, they stop eating it again, because it also impedes with their digestion. And what's interesting is that so a lot of the work that they do is also thinking about, so how can we increase the welfare of these animals and improve livestock industry? Because now what's happening is, in the livestock industry, all the animals get one diet. It's like what we as humans think this is all they need. That's what we give them, but it doesn't include any medicinal substances. So therefore, we give them tons of antibiotics, anthelmintics, resulting in huge resistance. But if you give animals the choice, they can actually medicate themselves. So they've done experiments either in a paddock where you grow a lot of different plants, they can seek out the plants they need, or even if you give them the different parts of the composed diet, you let the animals choose, they actually pick out what they need. And what is more, they all choose a different diet and they eat less. And that's because when they can pick out the different components of their diet, they're not limited by anything, right? So now if they have one standard diet, they keep on eating until they have enough of the most limiting component. That's like eating McDonald's to get enough protein, right? You need to eat a lot of burgers to get there. And so it's the same thing there. And so they have shown when you do this with cattle, they actually eat 20% less. They produce, so actually meat production is 20% cheaper and they produce fewer greenhouse gases, right? And all they're doing is saying, let's look at our animals, let's let them decide what they eat, let them medicate themselves, and we can really improve their health. So how do animals know all of this? And that's a really big question. And so people ask me about, so for the sheep and the goats, they do associative learning. They can associate the feelings with what they eat with recovery. So next time they can eat that plant that they knew helped them recover from something. For the monarch butterflies, we have absolutely no idea. But there's this great example of woolly bear caterpillars that were also infected where we understand what's going on. Now, woolly bear caterpillars often get infected by parasitoid flies. This is a parasitoid fly in monarch butterflies, so it's related, not quite the same. This picture I took. So here you have a monarch caterpillar, here are 3 maggots. So what parasitoid flies do, they lay the egg on top of the caterpillar. The maggot comes out of the egg, eats its way inside. Then these maggots eat the caterpillar up from the inside out until they're ready to come out. So that's what they did. You see the remainder of the caterpillar is completely hollow. So they eat all the non-vital parts. So the caterpillar stays alive, provides them with food. Then they come out, they pupate, and you get new flies. Caterpillar is dead. So this is like Alien, the movie Alien, right? This is exactly like they burst out. And again, if you love parasites, it's amazing. So this woolly bear caterpillar has one of those eggs there. So this one is going to be infected. But what these guys can do, they can actually change their diet and start ingesting more alkaloids. And these alkaloids are bad for the flies. They're also bad for the caterpillars. So too much kills the caterpillars, but the right dose kills the flies. And the way that they can do this is that these caterpillars have 4 taste receptors in their mouths, and one of them specifically responds to alkaloids. And researchers have shown with very steady hands and very tiny electrodes is that when you have an infected caterpillar, the taste receptors for alkaloids start firing at a higher rate. And so that essentially means that the caterpillar, just experiences that those alkaloids taste good and they eat more and more of it. And that then kills the fly. So that's a completely innate mechanism. These caterpillars don't need to learn, and they just have this built-in medicinal behavior. And this is probably true for a lot of organisms. So until the 1970s, no one really believed that behavior can be genetic and heritable. If you have read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, he actually gives one, because his whole point was if we need to understand cooperation and altruism, aggression, we need to show that behavior can be inherited, right? And so the classic example is hygienic behavior in honeybees, where the honeybees, so here we have brood cells, and so you have larvae or pupae in here, and those brood cells get capped, right? So they put wax over them. When the bees detect that one of those larvae or pupae is infected with a bacterium or something else, they open the cap and then take the larva out and dump it outside the colony, right? And that stops spread to other bees in the colony. And so experiments have shown that it's based on 2 genes. One gene that allows the bee to open the cap and the other that allows it to remain. You can cross them in all possible ways. So you can make bees that only uncap, bees that only remove, bees that do neither, or bees that do both. Very, very cool. So that was really shown. So what that means is a lot of very, what seems like complex behaviors are basically just in the genes. But I already mentioned with the goats and the sheep, they can do associative learning. There's also social learning. So chimpanzees, when they fold those leaves and swallow them, they actually can do that in different ways, and different groups of chimpanzees fold the leaves in different ways. So that shows that they have these cultural practices where one chimpanzee develops the behavior and the other ones will copy it. You also see that when sheep are raised with their mothers, they're much better at medicating themselves than when they're separated. So they really learn from each other, and they're also more willing to try new things around them. And so another, reason that it would be good to keep these animals together rather than taking these little lambs or little calves and just putting them in isolation straight away. All right, so let me talk a little bit about pets. So I know quite a few of you have dogs, right? Some dogs eat grass, right? They do. So here's my Tucky eating grass. Isn't he cute? This picture was taken by my son. You can see Jaap. And when I was getting all the images for the book, I need to get permissions, right? Some images we have to pay for, some of them we need to get permission, some are in the, are copyright free. So I had the form for Jaap, and I said, "Oh, Jaap, can you sign this form for the picture?" And he picks up and he looks at me, and I said, "There's no way I'm gonna pay you." You are gonna be a published photographer, that is enough. Like, oh shit, come on. I gave you that phone and that dog. And cats do this too. So, and this is cool too. So here is a cat eating grass. This is the Italian cover of the book, which is exciting. So dogs and cats do this. Why do they do it? Actually, very little research in domestic animals. But when you look across the whole order of the carnivores, which includes all these predatory animals that tend to eat meat, there's a few exceptions, like pandas, they eat mostly bamboo. But we see that a lot of these animals, whether it's wolves, mountain lions, tigers, they eat grass as well. And this is a very recent study that came out just a few months ago. And they looked at jaguars, and here you see a jaguar very heartily eating a bunch of grass. And then I spared you the throwing up picture that was in between A and G, because it was really gross. But this is the thrown up stuff. And look, there's a worm. And so that's a nematode worm. There were also tapeworms in that sample. This morning when I was walking my dogs, I saw this beautiful puddle of vomit on the bike path with grass. And I think it must have been a coyote. And so I, of course, went to check for parasites. There weren't any. This is, my family thing. I'm crazy, but that's okay. And then there is catnip. So, and this is another really great example. So, anyone has cats here? You know about catnip response? So whether it's live plants, or you buy toys that are impregnated with the chemicals of catnip, cats go crazy over it. And people have noticed there's Neolithic evidence that people have grown catnip for thousands of years. And this is some pictures from 1859 by a Japanese artist. And this is a story of the battle between cats and mice. And what the mice have done here, they have used silvervine, which is related to catnip, gives a similar response, and they have intoxicated the cats so they could win the battle. So people have known about this for a long time. But why do the cats do it? That wasn't known until a few years ago when Japanese researchers really started diving into it. And with that, I need to show you a few movies. This is really cool. These are the movies that they published with their paper. So they had silvervine. And one of the things they did is extract chemicals and divide the chemicals in different fractions. And then they would put those chemicals on filter papers in petri dishes. So here is a cat in a cage with 7 fractions of the chemicals to see what does the cat respond to. And so you see it testing out all the chemicals and see, which of the fractions is actually triggering this catnip response. Looks like it's not that great. There it goes, rolling around, licking. And these cats, they go in this euphoric state. They can do this for 15 minutes, nonstop. They just love it. So by doing that, they found one specific chemical that actually elicited this response. And so then they did other experiments. So here, we're going to look at a control trial, the same cat, and then a trial where they inhibited an opioid receptor. So this is involved in the pleasure response in cats. So when you block that receptor, there's no longer this pleasure feedback. So the prediction would be when you block it, the cat is no longer going to respond to this chemical. And this is nepentolactol, that is that single chemical. You first see that the cats start licking it, they do that with the plant, so that actually increases the emission of these chemicals, just like when we cook and we tear our basil or rosemary, we smell more of it, so the cats do that too. And they showed that with other experiments. Okay, so this is the same cat on day 2, when it has been treated. And no more pleasure, there it is, it's sitting, getting bored. But on the first day, when it still could feel pleasure, there it goes. There it goes. Catnip response. This cat says, get me out of here. Heard enough of this. Yesterday, you gave me pleasure. See, there's your freedom done. Wants to get out. Now, the cool thing is they did this with Amur leopards and tigers and zoos and showed the same thing. So cats have been doing this for 10 million years since their common ancestor. And then they did this other ingenious experiment where they said, okay, this rolling around, what is it for? Does it actually, you know, is it just because they go crazy and have fun? Or are they doing it to coat themselves in these chemicals? So here is a different case. Now the filter paper is at the top. You see the cat doing the same. It's licking to start with. It's getting very excited. And soon it's gonna rub, make contact with those chemicals, rub those chemicals in its own fur. There it goes. Oh, look at it. So cute. But it doesn't roll around on the floor. Right? So when it's up there, that whole floor rolling is gone. So what the researchers suggest is like they really do this to coat themselves in the chemicals. And they showed that that's what happens. So the chemicals get on their fur. Then they did experiments where they put cats on either side of a cage, one with the chemical, one without, release mosquitoes, a bit like you do, David, with your. And then they saw that the cats with the chemical don't get bitten as much. They get way fewer bites. They felt sorry for the cat, so then they put it on their own arms and did the experiments with themselves and found the same thing. And that's cool because that suggests you can use it for human use as well. And so in fact, they have actually patented this chemical as a mosquito repellent. Mosquitoes are a really big threat to cats because they suck blood. They also transmit things like heartworm and other things. So this is what we think now is what triggered that catnip response. So we can look at animals, come up with mosquito repellents. It's not that surprising because animals have been looked at by humans for thousands of years. And so when you look at traditional healers and shamans, they often look at animals. This is a bear shaman. When you look at the Native Americans here in North America, they often look at bears. Bears are their teacher of healing. So a lot of medicines that Native American tribes use are based on bears. They often even have bear in the name. And so by becoming a bear during the shamanic rituals, they thought they can learn from bears. Same with elephants. So this is a mahout who is this caregiver of elephants in Southeast Asia. And so they look at their elephants and learn a lot of the medicinal practices, for example, to treat diarrhea or stomach upset. They also actually make concoctions of the feces of elephants and drink that as a micro booster. So people have known about elephants using medicine for a long time and using that. This is Mike Hoffman actually talking to a traditional healer in Tanzania. This what he found is that Mohammedi's grandfather looked at elephants as well and saw the elephant had stomach upset. They used a particular plant, mixed it with water in the pharyngeal pouch, then got better, started using it. And that's a medicine that is used in Tanzania in a very widespread way. They also looked at porcupines to treat diarrhea and things like that. And so when you look at a lot of our modern medicines, right, they derive from plants. And so in a lot of ways, we can actually learn from animals how to find them. This is the opium poppy that produces opium, which actually was used for a lot of different ailments. You could just buy this on every corner of every street in the United States, not that long ago. And there's a lot of other things we discovered. Any thoughts while I'm showing goats? Where did we meet yesterday?
Dancing goats.
Dancing goats. So dancing goats. Why is that? So here's Kaldi. Kaldi was a herder in what is now Ethiopia. He was herding his goats. And he saw that the goats were eating the berries of the coffee bush and they became frisky and they became active. And he told a monk at a nearby monastery about it. And that monk took the berries, brewed this drink that we now call coffee, and found that it's really useful in becoming more alert. And so we can use that. And goats discovered that too. Goats also discovered horny goatweed. You can guess what that does. That's used in traditional Chinese medicine. You can buy that as noodles. That is a chemical that actually makes castrated rats get erections again. So it's amazing. But goats found that for it. And so then I already mentioned bears. One of the things really cool, aspirin. A lot of you may have used aspirin. Was discovered by bears, because when bears come out of their hibernation, they're all sore, all inflamed. The first thing they do is they go to willow trees, take off the bark, eat it, and that's full of salicylic acid. And it was in 1700s that the compound of that willow bark was discovered. Then Bayer made it into a drug we call aspirin. So you now look at a white tablet thing, so that's pharmaceutical. Yes, but the bears discovered it and gave it to us. So it's really intriguing. We can look at these animals. So the way I end my book is on a positive note following a really negative note. This is a table with extinct dinosaurs, and this is to say, what we're doing right now to our planet is causing the sixth mass extinction. And the problem with that is that we're not just getting rid of medicines that we could discover, or medicines for animals, we're also getting rid of the pharmacists and doctors of the animal kingdom that we can learn from. And so as part of the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail that Elizabeth already mentioned, my lab is really working to recreate a lot of native habitats. So this is plants grown in our greenhouse. This is at the Carter Center. You can see I got Jaap even to help give him some volunteer hours. He was very grumpy about it, but he did it anyway. So we're building these gardens. This is my own house. This is a pollinator garden. And really the idea is to get rid of some of that long grass that is not native, that requires a lot of pesticides, water, and fertilizer, replace it with native habitats, because that will really help our insects, but also our pets. If you plant catnip or plants, a lot of plants like valerian can reduce anxiety in your animals. So there's a lot of things that we can do. And so the end of the book is kind of talking about, let's do this and preserve all this beautiful medicine, all these beautiful doctors. And I will end with my buttons. This was actually the photo shoot for the Emory News magazine from last week, while we were getting ready to take the pictures. And then my dogs decided to medicate themselves. It's like, you guys are amazing. There you go. Thanks. Almost the whole hour. Sorry. But I'm happy to answer any questions if people have more time. Happy to stay around. I'm also not offended if you leave right now.
When is your book out?
Last week. Last week? 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago today. Yeah. So, and I have some extra copies if anyone wants to buy them for a discount today. Yeah. 10%? I get 40% off. Oh. So it's, what was it, 1837? Yeah. So.
Looks like that's very pretty.
They did. Princeton did a really good job.
Yeah, the cover is really cool.
Yeah.
I like the design.
I did a really nice book. So the spine is also very nice. Then you put it in the bookshelf.
All right, we have a question online.
Okay.
Rustin, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yep. Lovely talk, Jaap. Do you see any evidence of resistance developing?
It's a great question, and we see a lot less resistance than in the pharmaceutical drugs that are being used. And the leading hypothesis for why that is that most of these medicines that animals use are mixes of chemicals, whereas the pharmaceutical industry often creates pills based on a single chemical, and it's way harder for the pathogens to evolve resistance. For example, that resin that the ants and bees use, it's got hundreds to maybe thousands of compounds.
What was does for bees? I know I was using it and I feel like it sounds me a lot.
Yeah.
But what does it do?
So for the bees, propolis does the same that the resin does for the ants. So it reduces growth of bacteria, viruses, also the mites that transmit a lot of the viruses. And it's also, studies have also shown that it increases the diversity of the oral microbiome, which helps them when they're feeding their food. So lots of different benefits. But yeah, people have used it. if you go to South America, you can buy it anywhere. It's like a very, very common drug, but somehow when people look at animals, they couldn't fathom that maybe they used it for medicine too, and well before humans did. It's very interesting. Cool. All right, thank you all.